Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, I would just like to say that I picked what I thought would be a pretty easy subject to cover. What's happening to the birds in our area with respect to climate change. It became apparent really fast that it is a big subject to cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few slides. I've got a small PowerPoint presentation, and then I'm going to cheat a little bit and show you an hour-long video that I found on YouTube that I kept coming back to in regards to what's happening to the Puget Sound. And it not only affects birds, but it affects all fishing, all wildlife, and including us on the health of the sound. And there are more groups working on this subject than I could list. It was unbelievable how many different groups of people, whether those that cover the whole sound or one part of the sound, are working on the health of our sound. So I'll start out here. I'm going to share the screen and I'll go in here. Climate change and its effects on Puget Sound birds. I've changed this a little bit. It's really climate change and its effects on everyone that lives on or near the sound. So I started out, I was just going to show 3 or 4 species of birds that either migrate and live on the sound part of the year or live on the sound all year long. And the sound technically is part of what we call the Salish Sea, which starts from the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, actually goes down the coastline a little bit, goes through the strait, goes down into the sound, and goes up through the Strait of Georgia between Vancouver Island and British Columbia. And in this great area, you will find more seabirds than I can count. I didn't even try and count them. But here's an example of something that I pulled out of one of the videos that I was using for resource. Birds that dive in the Salish Sea are 11 times more likely to experience population decline than other birds in our area. So basically, that saltwater-based birds have to work much harder to feed themselves than land-based birds. Here's an example of a common loon that lives on the sound and in the Salish Sea. Between 1978 and 1979 to present, there's been a 64% decline in the common loons on our saltwaters. Scoters, 78 to 79 to present, 230,000 to 53,000, a 77% decline. Western grebe, 78, 79, 1.4 million. Today, 18,000.
That's sad.
Yes. There are some, not all, but some of the major factors for the decline in several species of birds on the Puget Sound. The number one is climate change, which actually affects all the others. They're all interrelated. Climate change affects overfishing, poor water quality, degraded habitat, and schooling susceptibility of forage fish. I'd like to say that in doing research for this, I started going on YouTube and just Googling in different phrases and words. It's amazing. It's amazing how much resource you can get just by looking at videos on YouTube. It reached a point to where I got saturated with it. There are so many different factors that deal in with our seabird populations that I started to realize that I couldn't really do justice myself, not really being a science-based person, on how to disseminate information that would be relevant to other. So, excuse me. So what I kept, like I said, I kept running into this presentation that's done by Dr. Nick Bond, and he's a Cooperative Institute for Coastal Ocean and Ecosystem Studies. Someone got their, please turn off your speaker if you can. So it's an hour-long video. It's very well done. This guy knows what he's talking about, and he manages to at least touch on most of the factors that are causing our seabird populations to crash. So hold on a second here. And if you have any questions, be sure and put it into the chat box. And after the end of the video, we will do some discussing. Now, my platform isn't 100% stable. So like I said, if my screen freezes for a little bit, give it a chance to come back. I don't know what's causing it. Supposedly I've got a great internet connection, but it likes to do this on occasion.
This will enable us to share the presentation with you and others who are interested in the topic after it's over. And now that we're just about ready to get started, I would like to say a few words regarding University House Wallingford and our speaker today.
Thank you, Elliot. As an ever living community in affiliation with University of Washington Retirement Association, our residents benefit from the partnerships developed with the University of Washington Schools of Nursing, Social Work, and Pharmacy to deliver innovative programs designed with healthy living in mind. We are pleased today to have with us Dr. Nick Bond, who has joined us today to present on a timely topic, climate change and the Puget Sound marine ecosystem. Dr. Nick Bond is a principal research scientist with the Cooperative Institute for Coastal Ocean and Ecosystem Studies of the University of Washington. He has a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the UW. His research focuses on the weather and climate of the Pacific Northwest and the linkages between the climate and marine ecosystems of the North Pacific. He is the climatologist for the state of Washington and, in his own words, proud to be a weather geek. Please welcome Dr. Nick Bond to University House Wallingford.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to take the opportunity to share my screen. And what you should be seeing here is one of the best drawn marlin you'll ever see. Our very own David Forsey, editorial cartoonist for a long time with the PI and now back with the Times. Can everybody see my screen and hear me fine? Hearing no objections.
Yep, we can hear you, Dr. Bond. Yeah.
All right, very good. I'd like to start off with this cartoon.
Jay, we're not hearing anything.
A marine heat wave that we had a few
There it
years
is.
and whether that, how much we've learned from that, a little bit about what we've seen in the historical record, what are the projections are showing, and I want to finish off with kind of some words of optimism, the actions that are being taken right now on behalf of Puget Sound that gives us reason to, for hope. And all of this is under kind of the lens of an the ecosystem implications from the biological side. Before we get started, I want to start with a little factoid that I think people will find fascinating, certainly I did. And that is basically important salmon in the Pacific Northwest was the economy in the late 1800s going into the early 1900s. There were tremendous runs in the Columbia River, but in the Puget Sound rivers too. And due to increase or improvements in the technology of canning, that resource was exported to the Eastern US and all the way to Europe. And there were boom times. A supervisor on a canning line could make $500 a month in the late 1800s. Unskilled Chinese immigrants provided room and board could make $200 a month, which was maybe 20 times what they could make in there was plenty of termination and mistreatment and so forth, but there were boom times. And in fact, a historian and also a publisher of a small newspaper in Southwest Washington has some pretty persuasive evidence that the little town of Chinook, Washington, near the mouth of the Columbia on the Washington side, had the highest average income of any municipality in the entire US for a number of years there in the late 1800s, basically because of salmon. The fishers did great, the runs were going great, and they didn't last forever and all that, but salmon was a big deal. All right. But let's talk about the issue at hand here. Here's just a map of the Puget Sound and part of the Strait of Georgia, what's commonly now referred to as the Salish Sea. It's kind of tilted on its side, so you're going to have to tilt your head to look at it in a familiar way. The darker the blue, the deeper the water. And one thing that's kind of interesting about the Puget Sound and Salish Sea is that it is relatively fertile, productive compared to most fjords. In fact, there's both entitled the fertile fjord, and in part that is because of this bathymetry and what it means when with the tides and so forth. There's a greater mixing of water from below with nutrients up to near the surface that kind of can fuel the whole food chain. And so compared to most fjords around the world, the Puget Sound is actually very productive. And so just to kind of start off, and I'm going to pose a few questions in here as we go, just to get audience participation. I would like to get some people's thoughts about what we might be looking at in this photograph right here. You see this white patch in the water. It's near Point Roberts, right near the Canadian border. Does anybody have, and guesses are just fine, what is this white patch with the hint it is a good thing? And you can submit your answer to chat, or if Elliot can unmute you, you can just shout out an answer. Either way. And anybody got to get this?
And Dr. Bond, we've got one guess, eggs of a marine creature. Oh, you're muted, Dr. Bond. Let me unmute you here.
So I'm unmuted now, right? You can hear me, right?
Yes, you're on mute.
Yeah, so that was an excellent, maybe more than a guess. Yeah, this is herring spawn. And it turns out that herring are a very important forage fish for harbor porpoises, salmon, and so forth. And that this concentrated spawn from the herring, you can see that seabirds are liking it too, is important because in some of the herring stocks in Puget Sound going back decades are definitely on the decline. And so the idea that maybe in at least in some places the herring are coming back is a good sign. And so again, tip of the hat to the person who got that answer right. All right. As promised or threatened, depending on your point of view, I want to kind of look back at the marine heat wave, otherwise known as the blob that occurred a few years ago, because it was kind of a wake-up call for the climate community. It turns out why it was such a big deal is if you look at water temperatures off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, and we have decent estimates that actually go back to the 1890s. There's year-to-year variations in kind of warm periods and cold periods. And then in just the last few years, 2014 to 2016, there was this huge spike in temperatures off our coast, unprecedented. And it had, all sorts of implications for the marine ecosystem, both in the open ocean and here in the Sound. And speaking of the Sound, a time series not going back nearly as far, but some work that was put together by the Department of Combination Department of Ecology in King County, just showing this top trace here shows kind of overall heat content in Puget Sound from 2007 through 2019. These red bars show the years of the blob where it was a lot more heat in the Puget Sound than usual. This middle bar chart shows salinity for what it's worth, and was kind of a lot of fresh water in there. And then importantly, this bottom chart shows dissolved oxygen concentration down with this period of warmer water. The red bars show deficits in oxygen content that can be a big deal for the marine ecosystem in some species. And so associated with that are some very notable fish kills in Hood Canal, for example. There's a red rock crab, an English sole. I'm not sure what those guys are, maybe sand lance or a lookout or something. But there were some big fish kills noted when the waters were really warm in Puget Sound and in many places low in dissolved oxygen. Just another way to kind of look at that is for a particular place in the southern part of Hood Canal, where we have time series from a mooring in 2010 through 2015 shown here, that shows how the oxygen varies with depth, where there's 0 means meters from the surface, and so the top part is right near the air-sea interface, and you're going down to 30 meters. Redder colors in this chart show more oxygenated water, blue colored low oxygen contents. And in Hood Canal, there's a kind of an ongoing problem with periods of low oxygen concentrations. But here in 2015, especially in the lower part of the water column, it really started early in the summer and got really bad, where the concentrations were getting, to the point where certain species were suffocating. And we were really bailed out. There was a very strong storm that came through in the late August of 2015 that kind of stirred up that water column and kind of reduced that effect. And if we hadn't had that storm, I don't know what would have happened. But again, this was some serious things that were associated with the blob in Puget Sound. And it wasn't just in marine waters, but in the freshwater habitat. I think when I gave the talk at University House last fall, I may have had the same figure, and so you're getting it again. But anyway, this is an example of the stream flow in the Nooksack River, South Fork for what it's worth, from January through September of 2015. This blue trace shows how much water was coming down the day by day. And the gold triangles show what the average is for that time of year. And during the that winter, it was really warm. There was plenty of rain, but not much snow. And so we had some floods on a lot of the rivers in Western Washington, but very little snowpack. And so the flow in the many rivers went into the toilet. There's a less polite way to put that, but it declined much earlier in the summer than it usually does. And that kind of low flow meant much warmer temperatures in the streams or early in the summer than usual, with the gold triangle showing temperature over the course of average temperature over the course of the summer, and into this blue trace what actually happened in 2015. And the consequence was some massive die-offs of the adult salmon that were trying to get back to their hatcheries and to their natural spawning grounds. And so this just happens to be a tributary of the Columbia in the gorge, the White Salmon River. There were other places this happened. The biggest contribution to freshwater in the Sound, the Fraser River had the same sort of thing, where it had big flows in the wintertime, shown this green trace, and kind of early in the summer, but because of lack of snowpack in its watershed, compared to the usual, the blue trace, again, the flows went down. They always decline in summer, but they declined sooner. And the consequence, again, was all kinds of implications for the salmon returning. And here's just an example of some fish that died before they could actually get into the hatchery there, the Wallace River in Idaho. All right. So the blob was kind of, maybe a dress rehearsal, wake-up call about the sort of things that we might anticipate with climate change. Despite what people are saying, it really is a real thing. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, just maybe how fast it's going to happen, but it's already happening to an extent, and we know it's going to accelerate. And so the question is, what can we do about it? So as kind of some background material, but with regards to climate change, one thing that isn't commonly appreciated is just how much of the extra heat in the climate system is being soaked up by the ocean. And we have very reliable measurements of this, that in the last few decades, that over 90% of the extra heat and about a third of the additional carbon is going into the ocean. And people are arguing about, the atmosphere, whether the warming is the same as what the models are showing or what. But that's a very small amount of the extra heat content in the system. And so we know that the whole climate system is warming up, and we know there's going to be that's going to continue, and there's going to be implications from it. Some of those implications were summarized in this report that's online from the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. This report weighs in at about 1,200, 1,300 pages. It's available online. Feel free to, easy to find. You can download it and read it for yourself, knock yourself out. I'm just going to have a couple of tidbits from it, but the message I want to get across is we're trying to, there's some serious work trying to figure out, how the ocean and the cryosphere, the glaciers and ice packs and so forth, are changing. And that's due to things like the marine ecosystem. And one thing to keep in mind is that it's not all doom and gloom. And that the idea, the sun's going to come up, there's going to be nutrients in the ocean, phytoplankton are going to grow, zooplankton are going to eat them, there's going to be a food chain. It's going to be different, but it's not like the world's oceans are all going to go into the Dead Sea or anything. They're going to be different places, and we got to manage them responsibly. But it's not like as bad as it might appear. All right, and as another point here to make, kind of bring home the idea that there's room for optimism or reason to hope. Here I have a plot going back to late 1930s when Bonneville Dam was installed with a fish ladder where they could count returning salmon. This shows through 2019 how many, the numbers of returning adult salmon were counted at Bonneville Dam. And to be sure, these numbers here early in the record in the 40s through 80s or so forth, between 250,000 and 500,000 fish returning each year is a lot smaller than the historical runs in the 1800s. Estimates maybe 10, 20 times that. But the main point on this graph here is note here since 2000, actually the returns have been quite a bit higher than they were in past decades. And so this is again, maybe not common knowledge. Now, not all stocks are in great shape. It's mostly the fall runs, not the spring runs. But again, it's not like all the runs are going extinct. And that brings up my next question here. And so Elliot has to work his magic here to either unmute people or, people can submit their answers to via chat. What do you think is responsible for these large increases in returns? Here again, this is on the Columbia River of adult Chinook starting around 2000. And of course, we want to know what's going to happen in the future, and the last couple of years haven't been so great. But what can we attribute this huge increase in returns? So, your turn. What do you think? Don't be bashful.
We have one guess, fishing regulations.
That's part of it. Yeah, there's a much depending on your point of view, kind of more restrictions on both sport fishery and commercial fishing and so forth. I don't think that's certainly a factor. I'm not sure if it's the leading factor. And so, anybody else?
We have another guess that says dam removal.
That's close enough that I've got to give credit and, get that guy a cigar or something, or gal a cigar. Yeah, it's actually practices, freshwater practices and passages. At that point we hadn't removed that many dams, but improving fish passages, both to get the juveniles down to the ocean in good shape and allow the adult salmon to get back to their hatcheries and spawning grounds and that sort of thing. That's a lot of it here. A lot of it also has to do with better ocean conditions for the fish when they went to sea as youngsters. And so, again, the main point here is, compared to many decades of these kinds of returns, we did have some very good runs in recent years. Now, I should say 2015, there were a lot of fish that got to Bonneville Dam that weren't able to get to their spawning grounds again because the water was so warm, but at least there were a lot of adults returning. All right, thanks for your responses. Now, when we talk about the changes, with climate change, it's not just temperatures that are changing. I don't want to go through all the details of this conceptual model here, but the chemistry is changing. There's going to be, obviously what the atmosphere is doing with storm risk, perhaps, rises in sea level. And so it's a very kind of complicated system, and we're still not sure how it's all going to play out, but we're doing our best to try to figure this out again so we can manage it more responsibly. And speaking of, some of the kind of interactions between different parts of the system, I know this slide breaks all the rules for presentation in terms of far too much stuff on it. But just the idea that what we're trying to do here, and this is an example for the region of the San Juan Islands, is trying to look at from the top, it's for various years, what the climate forcing was doing, what the kind of local conditions were like in the middle, what was happening at the base of the food chain and at higher trophic levels, and just trying to figure out how these different parts of the system connect. And so we're here, we will not be tested on, the results here, but just one thing to, additional point to make here is that we've had definitely in the 2014-16 kind of lingering, we've had this kind of warm era. And then there were some years right before it, it was on the cool side. And then before that, a kind of a more mixed bag. And so by having this kind of variability in what the conditions were like, we're able to kind of learn about how the system works. And I'll just skip this, but the main point here is that, yeah, that was for the San Juans. This is for Point Jefferson, Kitsap County, and that one size doesn't fit all. And then some places where it might have been during the blob years, kind of lower productivity, that wasn't necessarily the case everywhere. It's again, just the point of making it one size doesn't fit all. Speaking of phytoplankton and the base of the food chain, one thing that we've been seeing recently that happened to an extent before, but my understanding is in a bigger way than we've seen for a while, is just some of the species of the phytoplankton that are kind of growing and prospering in Puget Sound. This is in Hood Canal, and this kind of milky green water is from coccolithophores. They tend to do well with kind of low nutrient levels, and they can sometimes have a really big impact on the food web in that seabirds have a hard time finding their prey in this. Sometimes marine mammals also struggle finding fish because the water is just not clear enough. Some zooplankton don't like to eat them so much. And so this is something that, if not alarming, it's just kind of interesting that we had such a massive coccolithophore bloom in our waters recently. One thing that's definitely happened around here is that sea level is rising. We have a tide gauge in Elliott Bay that had good measurements of that back over a century. And different places have different rates of sea level rise just because of the geology of the region and the kind of recovery from the last ice age. But much of the Puget Sound area is the sea level is rising, and there are implications of that. The other thing, what the climate models are showing, getting back to the basics here, is that it is we're liable to see warming both especially in the North Pacific. This particular map shows how much warmer in degrees Celsius the models as a group are suggesting, kind of under a worst case scenario. In the kind of the first part of this century, 2006 to 2055, averaged over those years versus the latter half of the 20th century. And you can see definitely warming, especially in the higher latitudes of the North Pacific. What may be more relevant to our backyard is just what's happening around here. And what I was able to dig up here was more just looking at the end of this century, the warming that's expected, that the models are predicting, compared to kind of the start of this century. And here, the redder the color, the more the warming. The yellow ones less so. What you can see here is, and there's no general acceptance of this, is greater warming in and these are surface temperatures right along the coast than in Puget Sound proper itself. And that's in part because the water that's coming into Puget Sound, a lot of this, I think, comes in at depth where there's going to be a slower rate of warming. And so that's kind of good news in that we're not going to be seeing the same rates of warming probably that in the open ocean. But there again, if you really drill down days here in this Snohomish River Delta, then there's going to be kind of enhanced warming when you get right near the beach compared to the more kind of open waters of Puget Sound. And this could have implications for juvenile salmon, among other species. The other thing we're expecting with warmer air temperatures is more rain and less snow in the winter time. And so the idea there is that, and maybe probably wetter winters, and so kind of more floods, more water coming down the mountains in the winter time, less snowpack and less water available to coming down the streams to get us through the dry season of late spring through early fall. What these charts show, are changes here at 2050s, this middle row, 2080s, the bottom row. It kind of depends what the world does as a whole in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuel combustion, and so forth, with this high or 8.5 scenario being kind of a worst case sort of thing. But the idea is that if we continue along the path we're on, that there's going to be, especially toward the end of the century, considerably more runoff in winter than we're kind of used to and that the fish are adapted to, and a lot less runoff in the summertime when stream flows are already kind of on the low side. And what that means is a different kind of seasonality in the flow on our rivers. The Samish River that is up in Northwest Washington, very low elevation watershed, gets mostly, almost exclusively rain right now. With climate change, we think, and maybe a little bit wetter in winter. And so its seasonality of this flow isn't going to be too much different. So maybe a fish, if they can handle a little bit warmer temperatures, won't be too upset by the changes in the Samish. But the Snohomish River, which now gets both snow in and rain in the winter, and so has some floods, but also has a lot of snow melt to have a second peak in its flow with that snow melt in late spring, early summer. It's going to go to a rain dominant sort of system. And the Sauk River, that now is snow dominant, doesn't have too much in the way of floods and gets its main flows with the spring melt, is going to go to this kind of double 1-2 punch sort of system. And so the stocks that are adapted to this kind of seasonality in the flow, you know, in terms of their freshwater habitat that are changing are the ones that, you know, there's some concern about. The other thing is, again, just to, you know, kind of beating the dead horses, stream flows down in the summertime, that means lower flow means warmer water. And our anticipation is that more and more of the streams around Puget Sound, especially as we get later into this century, will have summer stream temperatures that are getting into the levels here that trout and salmon are not really very happy about. And in some cases, they can even get to you know, above 20, the fatal for some species and so forth. And so an increasingly fraction of the habitat is getting to be unsuitable for salmon. The other chance there is, as you know, temperatures are going up and things are changing, is that some real surprises there that we're going to get, just kind of like the blob was a big surprise, that we're going to get new combinations of both the climate and other parts of the system, and just the marine ecosystem will be pushed into a state it hasn't been pushed in before, and that whole community reorganizations. And this is something that we don't have a great handle on, but just still the possibility there of some nasty surprises is definitely out there. All right, another question for you guys. Here, you know, I've talked about the marine heat wave, the blob, and of course we have all, you know, always had heat waves on land, right? Land-based one. Last week we got to 94 at SeaTac, and it was pretty hot here for a couple of days. So the question to you guys: do you think there's going to be, just based on what our models are showing and kind of thinking about how this system works, do you think there's going to be any greater increase in the frequency of the land-based or marine heat waves? And here, you know, it's kind of, you got one, you pick one or the other. So it's easy question, right? And hopefully we'll get answers from both parties. Anybody? Anybody think it's going to be land-based?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, got some of them.
Yes, as well.
Okay, we got both. Well, good. Because what it actually looks like, and this is kind of a complicated graph, but yeah, certainly we're going to have more land-based heat waves. But even though there might be warming, more kind of warming of the air temperatures in the next few decades than in the water temperatures, we already have so much variability in the system that there's not going to, when you look at the tail of the distribution here, we're maybe going to have double the amount of heat waves when you talk about the top 1% of the hottest days or something. They're going to be occurring twice as often. But because the marine system, there's a lot of thermal inertia there, and not as much variability, a smaller shift in the ocean actually means a lot more marine heat waves. We talk about from the point of view of getting into that, the very upper 1% of the warmest temperatures. And so it's kind of a weird way about thinking of it, but for the marine ecosystem that is adapted to a very narrow range of temperatures, in a way they're going to have to adjust maybe faster than creatures on land like us. You know, getting right back to the kind of Puget Sound in particular, we know that based on historical records for this stock of Chinook salmon in Puget Sound, there is a relationship with temperatures where warmer temperatures, they tend not to do as well, not as many adults return. But, you know, it's kind of a shotgun blast here. There's not that much of the variability that's explained just by temperature. So it's not like we're exactly sure what's going to happen. I want to get back to a point that I raised before, and that's, you know, the temperature isn't the only thing changing. pH is definitely, our models are showing that's going down. The oceans are acidifying, they're absorbing carbon. That science is absolutely certain that that's happening. Exactly how fast it's going to happen is one thing. The other thing that it looks like is that in a lot of the world's oceans, the oxygen concentrations are going down. And so how is that going to play out in Puget Sound? Well, we know that there are some of the marine ecosystems, some of the species that have to build shells with lower pH, the ocean acidification, their shells, there's an energetic cost of building those shells, and there's even in some cases dissolving of them. And so some real implications of the changes of the chemistry there. And this is based on some very solid laboratory studies and so forth. Taking that another step, there's some folks have tried to look at the circled elements here, elements of the food web that are directly impacted by the pH of the ocean, and how that's going to link to other parts of the food web that both eat them or are eaten by them. You know, I keep saying how complicated the system it is to try to account for all these interactions. You know, I think you can kind of appreciate that. Some of the results are that, and I'm actually a little bit heartened by this, is that for some species, just perhaps it's the acidification is a negative impact, but it's not like it's going to necessarily devastate just from that alone. And from for what it's worth, as in many cases, there are some winners along with losers, and maybe the flatfish will kind of be able to prosper at the expense of some of these other species. Crab, definitely, they're not looking too happy as the due to ocean acidification in the South. Harmful algal blooms. You guys have probably heard about some of the big ones we've had in recent years, and with the warmer temperatures in the Sound, we're anticipating just a longer window in which those blooms can occur. Just warmer temperatures for a lot of the, in this case, this is Alexandrium that causes the paralytic shellfish poisoning, a real problem in Puget Sound waters, that just that window will be that much longer for this organism to thrive in Puget Sound waters. And so that threat will be that much increased. Another thing, getting back to a point I made before, sea level is rising, going to continue to rise. There's no stopping it. And what that's going to do to the estuaries around the deltas around Puget Sound. And here there's, I don't, by no means an expert on this, but for a salmon, for example, take advantage of different parts of different kinds of habitats, different parts of their life cycle as they're going from the freshwater to the saltwater habitat. And what we're anticipating with the sea level rise is changes in the in that, from, you know, places that are maybe brackish going to more saltwater marshes, other places freshwater marshes, less of those in some cases. And again, a pretty there's a lot going on here, but the idea that these kind of key regions, rearing areas for the juvenile salmon in particular, that there are going to be some changes with sea level rise and climate change. In terms of what I want to get into a little bit about now, and just to finish up the actions being taken on behalf of Puget Sound, and I end up on a, hopefully on a positive note. There's an entity called the Puget Sound Partnership that is a state agency. It's not regulatory, but it's kind of advisory in terms of leading the effort to restore and protect Puget Sound. And one of the things that I think is really important about what they're doing here is making the connection between human well-being and ecosystem health. And that the idea that people benefit from being outdoors and so forth, the whole forest bathing sort of thing, but you know, just going for a little walk along the beach. And the healthier the Puget Sound is, the more liable they are to do that. And so there are some direct benefits to humans, obviously, and there's been some work showing that money going into restoration of Puget Sound actually has payoffs in terms of making property along the sound that much more valuable and so forth. And so, you know, some work is being done on that behalf. There's a long ways to go. This chart here shows, especially for the Chinook salmon, that the orcas, you know, want to eat here, that these darker red colors show where the runs are definitely on the very low side. Only the lighter pinks are a little better, and you know, there's one example here that's the runs are in kind of deep. So we got a long ways to go, but we are working on it. And one of the things seems kind of simple, but it's just fixing our culverts. Not a cheap thing, but there's court order to do this, and that work not going as fast as a lot of us would like, but is proceeding and will have considerable payoffs to allow the adults to get back to their spawning beds and allow the juveniles to get to sea in good shape. And so this is something that's happening. Somebody mentioned earlier a dam removal. A real success story is the removal of the dams in Elwha. We just had the Nooksack is they're coming down now, and so this is dams that have outlived their functional purpose. We're starting to kick them down, and it's a real success story, especially in Elwha, where salmon are starting to recolonize that pristine habitat that was above the dam. I got to give a lot of credit to the tribes and what they're doing in terms of trying to improve the ecosystem of Puget Sound. There's Swinomish is one of the leading ones there. They have this climate change report when trying to figure out what's happening, where the bang for the buck can be. A lot of them are working on how can we return our streams to more natural conditions rather than just engineered channels to something that's more favorable for marine life, including but not just salmon. And I'm going to skip this one out of the interest of time. And yeah, there's some real examples here of successful restoration projects. Anybody, where do you think this picture was taken? Oh, bingo. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's there what has, you know, what might be considered strange bedfellows work together to kind of return a lot of that habitat to a more natural state, and you know, what payoffs for everybody from folks who just like to visit that wildlife refuge to the actual, you know, marine species and seabirds and so forth. Another reason for hope is some work that's been done a while ago about eelgrass. It turns out that's a really good habitat for a lot of species, smaller fish and invertebrates and that sort of thing. And it turns out it actually grows a little bit faster in warmer water. And some folks have figured out where, restoration projects would have, where there's the greater potential. And it's not like, these have necessarily been implemented, but there's a lot of the region here where if we had, the resources and the will to do it, we could do a lot to improve the habitat. And so warmer water isn't all bad. And then I also, getting near the end here, want to give a shout out to some of the municipalities, and one that with the Puget Sound Partnership is kind of a shining example is the city of Shoreline. It's Mayor Will Hall there, holding that sound, has been just a kind of a leader in trying to do do the right thing in terms of taking into account climate change and the actions on the local scale that can be done with that in mind. And so there is appetite for doing the things that we need to have done. And here, I don't know if any of in the audience is from Shoreline, but my hats off to Will Hall and company. So just to summarize, we had the blob a few years ago. That was kind of a wake-up call for the climate community, and we are learning about how the system works from what happened during that. Hopefully we can use that information to manage and restore that system. And I know there's a lot of pressing issues, both on a national and the kind of regional level and that sort of thing. I would argue that we actually have some of the resources to, if not bring Puget Sound back to the condition it was in 1850 or something, to help maintain its viability. And you've kind of tuned into this talk, and I imagine that I'll have a sympathetic audience here, but there are actions being taken on behalf, and that's going to be continuing. And so I'm looking forward to doing a little bit that I can do to kind of help promote that and keep this place as beautiful and healthy as we can. And so with that, I appreciate your attention, and let's open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. We really appreciate your time today and the truly veritable wealth of information that you shared with us. We do have one question that came in a little bit earlier. It was while you were talking about whether it would be more likely to have marine or land waste.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, are you seeing my face or are you seeing an old screen?
We're seeing that one of his slides yet.
Let me get that out of there.
There we go.
Well, as you see from his talk, he didn't really say a heck of a lot about birds, but when he's talking about fish, he's indirectly talking about birds too, because everything affecting what's going on in the sound goes up the food chain. And really, if you sit back and look at it, what's occurring on the sound is food chain disruption. It's all caused by climate change, but it goes off from there in a whole bunch of different directions. Everything from spawning grounds for forage fish to shellfish that diving ducks eat to just about anything that deals with what comes down the streams into the sound. So it's a very complicated subject that, like I said, overwhelmed me. But I thought that by showing something that from someone that actually knows what they're talking about, they would give us a better idea of why we're seeing less birds on the sound. And the solution for seeing more birds is the same solution for saving our planet. We need to get the carbon dioxide out of the air and out of the oceans. Are there any questions?
Not a question. This is Kalen. Not a question, but a comment. It was neat to, first of all, you might have noticed that Nick Bond works at the University of Washington Atmospheric Science Department. He actually, in my last class at UW, he was one of my instructors. It's kind of interesting, and some of the research that I've done in the last year in the department, not directly necessarily related to what he was talking about today, but offhand somewhat related to the blob, looking at relationships between sea surface temperature anomalies, so the differences from normal, and air temperature anomalies in Washington state. So it's just a lot of that research was kind of piggybacking off of some of his work. So it was really neat to see kind of him exploring not just oceanography, the ocean components or atmosphere components. It was neat to see him, neat to see a video of somebody that, talking about kind of a holistic picture of change moving forward. So that was neat.
Thanks, Kalen. I think it's really easy for us as birders belonging to Audubon to kind of narrow our focus to just what's happening with the birds. And I think it's good to see how everything else is interrelated with it and to get an overall picture as you're talking about what's going on. And it's overwhelming in one way, but in another way, it's something that everyone should be worried about. I don't like to use the word worried, but that's really what it is. This is something that it's only through education of the masses, which we're part of, that there will be a chance for us to actually make change. Any other questions?
Jay, this is Barbara. I put mine in the chat and I will read it to you. Given the success of the Elba Dam removal, do you know, are there other proposed dam removal projects in our state that you know of?
Thanks, Barbara. I know that they would like to yank a couple of dams off of the lower Snake River. And if you want to talk about water temperatures being very important, the Snake River gets way too hot in the summertime for any kind of fish other than bottom fish to live in. And it's between, I think the dams are Ice Harbor Dam and the one after, which I always forget the name of, which the Palouse River flows into just before the dam. But yeah, there are a couple dams in Eastern Washington, and there are several dams over here that get talked about. But as far as I know, they haven't gone past the talking stage. Now, maybe Kalen or someone else out there knows a little bit more about that than I do.
Thanks, Jane.
Removal of the dams is only part of the picture. I don't know what else to say. Does someone else have a question? Well, in that case, I would like to thank everyone for sticking around to hear someone else talk at you for an hour. I need to do some more learning about how to give a presentation and pull stuff off the internet because it's interesting just seeing it. And if you get a chance to go into YouTube and just Google something like birds of the Puget Sound or backyard birds of Washington, and you'd be amazed how many videos are already out there that exist that will give you information about what's happening around here. There are so many different groups involved in different parts of the Puget Sound that it almost is like there needs to be a clearinghouse to bring them all together and throw them into one giant video that will cover all the subjects. But then you're going to need about 36 hours straight of sitting watching a video screen to see it. So, well, in that case, everyone have a good rest of the January, and in February we have another meeting, and that was what I forgot to do. I was going to look up to see what is occurring next month. But if you go on our website, you'll be able to find out what it is.